Welcome to 99 zu 1. Today we are talking about this great book, Revolutionary Social Democracy, Working Class Politics Across the Russian Empire, 1882 to 1917. We have the author of the book here, Eric Blanc, Blanc. Before I will ask him how to pronounce that in a second. Before I get him in, a few dates about Eric. Eric is the author of the books Red State Revolt, The Teachers Strike With, and Working Class Politics, that came out in Warsaw 2019. And of course, this nice book, Revolutionary Social Democracy. He is also an assistant professor of labor studies at Rutgers University, researching strikes, new workplace organizing, digital labor activism, and working class politics. You can receive his newsletter of his research by signing up at laborpolitics.substack.com. And his research has appeared in journals such as Politics and Society, New Labour Forum, Labour Studies Journal, as well as publications in The Nation, The Guardian, and Jacobin. I think that's it so far, so let me get him in. Eric, welcome to 99 Zeit.
Thanks for having me on.
Did I miss anything in your bio? Should I mention?
No, that was pretty extensive. Thank you.
Okay, great. Eric Blanc. Blanc.
It's fine.
Blanc. Okay, good. I got that. Yes, this great book. It's a history book, to be clear. It has the title "Revolutionary Social Democracy." Can you first explain what that means? What is revolutionary social democracy?
Sure. Revolutionary social democracy was the term used during the golden era of the Second International, the Socialist International, by which I mean up until World War I, to refer to essentially the left wing of the Second International, the quote-unquote orthodox Marxist wing. So this was the wing of the Second International that was sort of identified with Karl Kautsky, but it was also identified with Lenin, with Rosa Luxemburg. And what my book does is focus specifically on what revolutionary social democracy looked like across all of the Russian Empire, not just in Central Russia.
So the all of the Russian Empire, what do you mean by that? Like, it's not just Russia, there's more to it.
Right. So the overwhelming majority of works written about the Russian Revolution and the revolutionary movement under Tsarism focus on Central Russia. Think about St. Petersburg, Moscow. This is understandable. These were important. These were the capitals. But in fact, a majority of the Tsarist Empire, the Russian Empire, in this period were not ethnic Russians. And a vast majority of the socialists in the empire were not ethnic Russians or even assimilated Russians. So what my book does is really try to bring back this history, which is really rich, of the Finnish socialists, the Polish socialists, the Latvian socialists, Jewish socialists, Muslim socialists. And when you look at the totality then of what their movements represented and what their politics were, then you can actually see much more clearly what revolutionary social democracy was. You can see what, if anything, was unique about the Bolsheviks. And as we'll talk about more, I argue that they were much less exceptionally unique than most people take for granted. So by looking at the empire as a whole and looking at the revolutions in 1905 and 1917 as a whole, I was able to kind of ask big questions about what does socialist politics look like, and hopefully I was able to provide compelling answers. It remains to be seen how you take them or how other people.
No, it's a very compelling book. It's also a nice read. So yeah, I mean, it's history. You gotta like history, but if you like history, this is really great.
My wife has not read it yet because it's sort of it is a bit of a deep dive. So
yeah, it is indeed. It's very specific. I mean, that's also basically my next question, because it's so specific, dealing with the outskirts of the Russian core, let's say, of that empire. You've been working on this book since 10 years, right? So that's also long before, it's considerably long before the first Bernie campaign, before, socialism in the US got the new liftoff, etc. How did you get that idea? Why did you want to write a book or research this kind of stuff in the first place?
Yeah. Well, so I've been a labor activist for a long time. I've been a socialist activist, and my political training since I was 2016 was it started in the Trotskyist movement. And so I was very much part of a Leninist cadre organization that engaged with the Russian history very strongly, because the idea was more or less that the Bolshevik Revolution and the Bolshevik Party provided a type of model that we should be emulating across the world. You know, there might be some differences, but at its core, building a revolutionary party and trying to implement like a workers' revolution, like the October Revolution, that was the goal. And so that meant reading a lot about this history. And my entry into this book actually was looking at anti-racist debates in the US and trying to look at what kind of the fight against what we call racism, what they call the national question, but it reflects pretty similar dynamics.
Identity politics, right? So,
yeah, right. So you can use different terms for it, but basically looking at how oppression other than class was dealt with by socialist movements in the Russian Empire. And so I started reading about the Jewish Bund, and I read about some of these other groups that were of oppressed nationalities within the Russian Empire. That's what got me interested in the project. And it turned out there wasn't a lot written about these books in English. And so at a certain point, I read everything in English and I was like, oh no, but like what actually happened? And I realized that somebody could and should write the book on essentially the socialist movement outside of Central Russia. And in the course of the research, I came to focus a little bit less specifically on the national question, because the more I dug into the sources, on the one hand, it became clear that the national question was always actually secondary to some of the broader, or almost always secondary to some of the broader strategic debates over, who do you ally with? Do you make alliances with liberals? What is your conception of revolution? What is your conception of the party? So these bigger issues that to me felt even more relevant for the kind of contemporary US and world-wide debates on the left became more of the focus. So trying to move away from just the national question and ask some big questions about, what was effective revolutionary strategy back then? What, if anything, might we learn for today? And, what is the relationship between political regimes and contexts and socialist strategy? I think that's really the heart of the book, is trying to make sense of the extent to which strategy and tactics really have to shift depending on different conditions. And the Empire gives kind of a good case study because you have different types of contexts that you can compare.
Right. So, 10 years ago you started, you also went to Europe and you studied like archives and read through letters and books, etc. So pretty extensive work. Since this book has been in development for so long, or at least, taking shape for so long, how do you see the book's particular relevance today? Or do you think it is, I don't know, more relevant today than when you started out with this project, or maybe less, or something like that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I've been happy to see the response to the book, which at least in the United States, there's been a resurgence of democratic socialism and of socialism generally. And I was really happy that people I do not know, it's not like direct comrades of mine, are organizing study groups on the book, and they see it as relevant for the organizing they're doing. So to me, that sort of vindicated this whole project, because it's a book that I do think will appeal primarily to either people who are history nerds and nerds of the Russian Revolution. So if you're into this type of history, because I learned 5 or 6 new languages for the project, and so there's like a lot of just sort of new information about what happened. So I think that, and it's an exciting history. It's about mass revolutions. It's about how close we got to overthrowing capitalism. There's a lot of, I think, just sort of inspirational, historical, even detail that people don't know. So I think if you're a history nerd, people would like it. The main audience I really had in mind when writing this book was left and socialist activists and people who are interested in left politics, for whom the Russian Revolution, for the last century, it's loomed really large. For the radical left, the Russian Revolution was just sort of this central strategic example. And I think the relevance is in part trying to challenge that hegemony for the radical left. And so in doing so, also to raise questions about what a different approach might be, what a democratic socialist Marxism would look like. So I do think that the big questions that the book deals with, I purposefully focused on the types of issues that to me seem still relevant today. So questions of, for instance, the relationship between intellectuals and non-intellectual workers, or, you know, the debates, that's how they framed it at the time, which is similar to a lot of debates you have in the US and perhaps elsewhere about college-educated versus non-college-educated workers. And it's in many ways parallels debates over identity. You know, how do you build organizations with people from different levels of privilege? And there's debates in the book that were really central about who do you, like, when and how can you make alliances with liberals? So this is like a very central debate still. And so I try to look at what worked in the Russian Empire and also raise questions about the extent to which the types of politics that revolutionary social democrats implemented in Russia and more broadly in this era might have made sense for their context, for instance, like an autocratic context, but might not be as relevant for a democratic capitalist country, like certainly across most of Europe. We can maybe bracket the US, which is a sort of exceptionally undemocratic capitalist democracy. But I think similarly, one of the big debates that the book deals with and that I do think is relevant is whether state, basically, what is your orientation as a socialist towards the state? Should you be always trying to overthrow it? Can you work within parliaments? Is parliamentarism and universal suffrage compatible with socialist rule? And the argument I come down on is yes. And you even see this in the Russian Empire, because the one part of the empire in which there was political freedom and a democratic elected parliament, Finland, the politics that socialists implemented to lead workers to power successfully in 1917, 18 was a democratic socialist Marxism. In other words, it looked towards electing a majority to the existing democratic bodies of the state and using those democratic bodies to fight against capitalist minority rule. And so I think those are some of the big lessons that are still relevant for today, even if some of the particulars of Russian history are less. And actually, part of the argument is that certain things that are part of the left radical culture that still shapes activism today shouldn't be relevant. Part of what I'm arguing is that there's a lot of accumulated traditions and dogmas that actually we should be discarding. And so looking at the extent to which these traditions were rooted in a organization and a politics based in like a really despotic autocracy, i.e. a really different context, that raises the question of actually maybe we need different strategies and tactics for different conditions today.
Yeah, very good. I mean, now you already kind of scratched like one of the core arguments that you make in the book. I want to still ask this next question that kind of asks you to repeat that again, because I think that's a very important point. So when talking about, you know, the so-called successful communist revolutions, immediately the Bolsheviks come to mind, right? The narrative here, at least in Germany, within Marxist-Leninist groups, let's say, is that the Bolsheviks were just, you know, they were under the tutelage of Lenin. They were the most radical. They were the most determined social democrats, and thereby they managed to topple the regime. While, you know, social democrats in other countries of the empire, and also, for example, in Germany, that's always brought up, they were more influenced by opportunism. They were especially, you know, influenced by Lenin's opponent, Karl Kautsky, who taught them this opportunism and reformism, maybe. And your work challenges all this stuff fundamentally and shows also historically that this is just wrong. Can you present this argument to us for a second?
Sure. And right, as you mentioned, I sort of hinted at it before. And so to be really specific, I argue, and I think I show, that revolutionary social democracy, which some people might call Kautskyism, I don't like that term, was actually very revolutionary. And it doesn't, I'll put it this way, for many of your listeners who I'm presumably have a good knowledge of, or some knowledge of the German social democracy and the reformism, and that led to supporting World War I. There's this famous betrayal of Second International Marxism. And the way it's normally taught is that this was rooted in some sort of deep flaw in the Marxism of the Second International and Kautsky.
A theoretical flaw, basically.
A theoretical flaw,
yeah,
right.
Right.
But the strategy was wrong. And the proof was that the German social democracy supported World War I and then betrayed the 1918-19 revolution. So this is sort of a standard argument for the radical left. And that therefore communism and the Bolshevik revolution points to a different strategic orientation, a better one, in fact, the only one that can overthrow capitalism in all countries. And what my book argues and shows is in Germany, the leadership didn't follow this strategy. Kautskyism, if you want to put it that way, wasn't certainly by like 1910 onwards, but really even earlier, that strategy orienting the leadership of the party. And so you can't actually blame Kautsky's theories for what was essentially like a sociological process of bureaucratization and of a leadership not committed per se to some sort of principles. In Russia, in contrast, the existence of an autocracy meant that the types of sort of incorporation that you saw in Germany these dynamics weren't replicable. You couldn't have sort of this slide in practice towards reformism, if you want to think about it that way, because there was a brutal state that would, break up your meetings all of the time. There was not a democratically elected parliament. The kind of space for a more moderate socialism just wasn't there to the same extent. And so what that meant is that the parties across the board in the Russian Empire tended to actually implement the politics of social democracy, unlike the vast majority, almost all other parties of the Second International, which tended to discard it. And so what I show is that the Bolsheviks, like a lot of the other radical parties in the Tsarist Empire, implemented Kautsky's policies and theories, and they led that to a successful working class conquest of power. And so that meant the Latvians, meant the Poles fighting for this. It meant a whole variety of ethnic groups that ended up fighting for Soviet power in 1917. But it also meant in the one part of the empire, which I mentioned as Finland, in which there was a different political context, that they implemented the type of strategy that Kautsky had articulated specifically for like Germany, which is to say a slow accumulation of organizational and political strength oriented towards winning a majority in parliament that in turn would make a socialist revolution possible. And they implemented that in a revolutionary way. They didn't make strategic alliances with liberals. They were very hard on sort of class antagonism and in educating workers towards this final goal. And in Finland, they did it. They led workers. They won a majority in parliament in 1916, and then they tried to implement their program. There was a capitalist counter revolution and against this democratically elected parliament. And in response, the Finns seized power in early 1918. This was more or less the kind of scenario envisioned by a lot of revolutionary social democrats for context in which a parliament existed. They always said that the rest of Russia would be an exception because there was an autocracy. And so essentially what I show then is these theories did lead to working class conquests of power. It's a separate discussion, which maybe we can get into, of why these regimes either were toppled by the German army or why they fell into totalitarianism. But I think we need to analytically distinguish between the ability to take power and overthrow capitalism and then what happened afterwards, because a lot of what happened afterwards was contextual. It was really hard after World War I to do anything. And so I think we need to be able to look at what the strategies that led to working class conquest of power, because that's ultimately what's most relevant for today.
So how about this presumed adversary relation between Lenin and Kautsky? So, okay, Kautsky was, and I think that even some people that read a bit about this stuff in general, they can see that Kautsky was hugely influential. I don't know, the big beef between Kautsky and Lenin probably started then also after the beginning of the World War. at least from Lenin's side, that's when he became really vicious in his writings against Kautsky. But would you see that, was there a theoretical difference between the two, or were they more or less aligned in how they thought to go along?
Yeah, so it really depends on which period you're talking about. And so this is where so much of the confusion arises. It is certainly the case that up through 1910, up through 1914, Lenin saw himself as a follower of Kautsky. He was very explicit about this. There's actually no room for doubt that both politically and in his self-conception, he saw eye to eye with Kautsky. And he says this over and over again. And Lars Lee is a historian who sort of demonstrated this pretty conclusively. The tricky thing happens is after 1914 and all of the debates and splits, Lenin does start to change his orientation. And simultaneously, Kautsky starts turning to the right as well. In fact, it started a little bit earlier with Kautsky. But on Lenin's side, particularly after 1917, you see a very serious break on two questions in particular, which become the kind of foundational difference in strategy between Leninism and the early Communist International and social democracy. These are two things in which there really is a break. And one of them is that based off of the experience in Russia, Lenin and the communists project that actually we're not going to, in democratic countries, try to win a majority to parliament. This is a dead end. That's going to lead you to reformism. You're not going to ever overthrow capitalism. You're just going to end up kind of accommodating our enemies. And so what we're going to do is essentially replicate the Soviet model by trying to set up workers' councils, workers' and peasants' councils everywhere. So you have an orientation more towards dual power and an insurrection to overthrow the entire existing state everywhere, not just in Tsarist Russia. And this is an important difference because in Russia, revolutionary social democrats for decades had always said, yeah, of course, you're going to need an armed uprising in Russia because you have a Tsarist autocracy there. You have no other option. And so what Lenin and the Bolsheviks after 1917, not actually even during, but really after 1917, from 1918 onwards, start doing is they project this as something that has to be replicated in its essentials across the rest of the world. And then simultaneously, because they have this new conception of state and revolution that kind of rejects the parliamentary road, if you want to think about it this way, towards socialism, they simultaneously argue that you need parties that are much narrower politically and that are fully committed to this harder revolutionary, pure revolutionary strategy. And so everywhere they push for splits from the old parties. And they have a conception of democratic centralism, which takes on different forms. But the essential shift is towards much narrower, programmatically stricter parties with more internal discipline. And this is the other difference, is the Leninist party becomes really much, that is a new thing that Kautsky didn't really ever articulate. And certainly the practice went even further towards a kind of tendencies towards sectarianism and dogmatism than the early Second International, which had a much more kind of culture of internal differences and I think a theoretical openness to thinking through these questions that gets a little bit lost with the new Leninist tradition. So in short, Lenin does change his position. And Kautsky, which we can talk about if you want, also in this period moves a little bit to the right. So this earlier tradition of revolutionary social democracy gets a little bit lost because nobody is raising the banner in this period in a strong way for this other tradition of revolutionary politics, but with an orientation towards democratic socialism and sort of using an expanding republican democracy instead of completely trying to get rid of it.
Okay, so I mean, one of your central arguments then, historically speaking, is that the feasibility of revolutionary strategies was, at least in that time, highly dependent on the social structures in which the revolutionary organizations would find themselves in. And if you have an autocratic, dictatorship or aristocratic regime where there is no parliamentary participation, no way to actually influence the political decisions of the state in some way, then revolutionary toppling by force was more likely to work, just empirically speaking, than in countries where you actually had parliamentary democracies. And that's also a little bit, you say that's also a little bit, or explicitly actually, Kautsky's, strategizing behind this idea. Now, the Marxist-Leninists would answer, well, but wasn't Lenin right after all when accusing, or weren't the Bolsheviks right after all, accusing the Social Democrats in the West, or in the, let's say, not in the core Russia, that if they were to try to take power on the parliamentary road, they would either be co-opted by capital or stop dead in their tracks once they were successful. I mean, isn't Finland the best case for that, where they actually took power and then the power at the power that was there before decided not to let that fly?
Sure. So a big part of the book, as listeners probably have a sense, is looking at the Finnish example, because this is an example of this strategy leading to workers' conquest of power. And so the first thing to say is this actually disproves a central Leninist argument, which is actually this strategy won't lead to the conquest of power. So this is a big thing, right? That the argument is if you try to win a majority through parliament, you will actually never overthrow capitalism. You end up making too many compromises.
Get co-opted, etc. Yeah.
And in fact, Finland shows, no, this strategy did lead workers to take power. And so then the response of Leninists is usually to kind of move the goalpost and say, well, but look, they didn't stay in power, which is actually a different argument. I'll give a few brief reasons of why this is not a convincing argument. First of all, it's hypocritical for Leninists, or at least it's hypocritical for Trotskyists to raise this question, because they acknowledge that the Russian Revolution very quickly in Central Russia degenerated, and actually workers lost their control of the state, and that there was a bureaucratic degeneration. And they blame that on the context. And I think they're not wrong. There was imperial intervention, there was famine. And so their argument is like, well, look, the revolution didn't turn out the way we hoped it would because of adverse circumstances, right? And I think that's an accurate enough assessment. But you have to be able to therefore look at whether that might also be true in Finland. And it turns out it is true in Finland, that the reason that there the Red government didn't stay in power was primarily military. They didn't have enough arms. It was a very small country. It hadn't even been involved in World War I. And they got decimated by the German army combined with the Finnish whites. And this was not the product of having like parliamentary illusions. They were fighting a civil war and they lost a civil war. So you have to, I think, use the same focus on context for explaining the downfall of the two regimes, which took different forms. And we should just say, even in the Bolsheviks in places in this time period that were close to Germany, oftentimes got overthrown. So like the Latvian Finnish government, the Latvian Bolshevik government in 1918 also gets overthrown. But we don't say that this invalidates kind of Leninism. It just means that they didn't have enough arms and military strength to defeat a very strong army. And I'll just do one broader point about how I look at this, which is it's actually important to acknowledge that there hasn't been a successful socialist revolution in a capitalist democracy. So I'm not actually arguing that the Finnish example is exactly replicable for socialists today, because even Finland was a relatively restricted, what I would call a low inclusion parliamentary democracy, in which the extent of kind of parliamentary power was constricted. It was very much actually like Germany up until 1918. This is the best kind of analogous situation. So there was a parliament, there was universal suffrage, but the Tsar could overturn it sometimes. And the political freedoms were there, but they were kind of precarious. People were always worried about whether their organizations were going to get shut down if they went too far. And so that's actually a different context than, for instance, most of Western Europe today, or even a lot of other countries. And so I don't think we have a model exactly for what socialist revolution will look like. we can get some strategic guidelines based on what's worked and what hasn't worked. But that's actually a really important insight, that we don't have this model. So that pushes us to become more rigorous about analyzing the concrete situations in front of us, rather than thinking that there's sort of a prefabricated strategy that we just have to implement for today.
I mean, the failure, relative failure of nearly all these projects on the long term should teach us not to just try and repeat them, but actually maybe come up with something beyond them, right? So,
and I just add one other thing, though,
yeah,
and this is important, is it depends on what you're looking at as criteria for success and failure, because in some ways,
yes,
the success of moderate, socialism or democratic socialism, you can argue has been by orders of magnitude higher than radical parties to their left, which is to say that so many of the gains that have been won by working people over the last century, not just in Europe, but across the world, have been, things like the welfare state, things like the expansion of democratic rights, things like the recognition of trade unions. These types of gains have made differences for millions and millions of people's lives, and they haven't gotten us socialism in the grand scheme of things. But I think you can make a strong case they've actually gotten us closer to socialism, and you're not going to be able to get to full democratic socialism if you're not able to build off of these gains that were won. So I do think it's a mistake to sort of just completely write off this other history as a complete failure, because in fact, so many of the gains of humanity have been brought by socialists who are at least to the right of Leninists.
Well, speaking about that, I mean, what would you say to people that would claim the opposite? I mean, to be honest, I find myself many times in this kind of situation where I feel like, I mean, objectively, if you speak about progress in terms of welfare and progress in terms of, the Steven Pinker argument, how many people are still hungry, etc., you can definitely show progress. But in terms of, the viability of a communist socialist idea and project to actually be advanced, has been undermined by the welfare state too, right? So, I mean, in some way, the dependence of citizens here in Germany, for example, on the welfare state has intellectually undermined their possibility even to think of alternatives or to move to alternatives. So what would you say there?
That's interesting. I don't know the German context as well, but I think that the counterexample to what you have articulated there is to look at the places where the welfare state has gone furthest, and in fact, in which the socialist movement in capitalist countries has gone furthest, which are the Nordic countries. And so I do know that,
Sweden,
like, for example,
yes.
The Swedes quite well. And so it's not true that in the countries in which the welfare state was most expansive, that this led to a restriction in sort of socialist visions. It led to the opposite. So in Sweden, and actually in many of the Nordic countries, the depth of the welfare state created higher expectations, which by the 60s and 70s actually led to a radicalization within the social democracy, saying now that we've gotten essentially the strongest welfare state we can imagine under capitalism, now the last thing we need to, that we're still missing, is economic democracy. And sort of the internal dynamics then of the social democratic project as it was implemented there, which actually I think is more of a democratic socialist project than like what we would call social democracy today, led the Swedish labor movement and its parties to push in the 70s for the Meidner Plan, which essentially was to democratize the economy. So I think that the most realistic path through which we would get to socialism in context of capitalist democracies looks more like that, in which you have a robust enough social democracy that people see its limitations, and that in context of struggle, you would push beyond those. So this gets us a little bit far afield from the topic, but I think it's important to say that the welfare state then as such, I don't think is a block towards the type of sort of emancipatory, revolutionary even potential that we need. It's very hard, for instance, in the United States, where we have such a weak welfare state, to even get a mass class-based movement going, because so many people are atomized. So there's so few rights for labor unions. So the opposite of having a strong welfare state can also be very demobilizing, and that explains the kind of exceptional weakness of the U.S. labor movement historically.
No, I would just answer. I mean, I totally understand I think I totally understand the situation that you find yourselves in, and I also know what you're referring to. A situation of the union membership across the US, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, I do not have the feeling, like at all, that we are in any way, in any shape or form, able to mobilize a workers' movement any better than you guys are, even though it might seem like that to you. But we have like quite established institutions that have been there since the 60s, 50s, 60s. That's true. And I mean, that's also a time of prosperity for Germany and Europe in general. So
that might have more to do with neoliberalism, which has sort of ravaged Germany than the existence of welfare state, right? So I think that the like specific situation in Germany or much of Europe today, which is clearly very bad, I wouldn't blame that per se on the welfare state, which actually also existed in periods in which, the 70s, for instance, there certainly was a strong radical left still in Germany, and there was a strong welfare state.
No, absolutely. And my point was exactly that you had a period of economic prosperity where if you talk abstractly, I would characterize it as capital and the state could afford this kind of welfare state, and at a point where profitability rates are going down, 80s, 70s, 80s, and all the way up till today, and not really recovering. This cannot be afforded anymore. But at the same time, today we are still left with this kind of dependence on, and this idea that this will still get us somewhere, while I think it's just not today, at least. That might change again, but today at least it's not in the capitalist card deck for us to go back to the welfare state of the 80s. That's not going to happen here. That's the only doubt that I would have there. But it's a very interesting conversation that I would like to have on a beer with you. But I have a couple of more questions, so let's maybe move on. One thing that I would like you to elaborate a little bit, which is like a thematic jump now. You extensively talk about the centrality, really, of the non-Russian population to the social democratic organizations across the Russian Empire. That's also was kind of new information for me, how central and how important they were to the actual success of the Soviet revolution, let's say. Can you explain this a little bit? How this differs also from the common perception on that, that's a Russian revolution that started in Moscow and St. Petersburg, etc.
Yeah, so I was also surprised to find out how central these non-Russian peoples and parties were to the revolutionary process. So in 1905, for instance, which is the sort of dress rehearsal for 1917, famously, the revolution went much further in the periphery of the empire. And so workers actually took power in much of Latvia, in large parts of Ukraine, in Georgia, parts of Poland. And the revolutionary movement there was stronger. It was also tended to be more radical. So that was 1905. And the parties themselves, the sort of beyond the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, were stronger. I think about 75% of socialists in the empire were part of these parties outside of the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. So you're talking about massive movements that had hegemony within their, not just working class, but national liberation struggles. And then in 1917-18, again, you see the absolute centrality of these revolutions in a few different ways. One is that the conception of the Bolsheviks was that, and really actually all revolutionary social democrats, including in the periphery, was that the revolution would start in the Russian Empire, and it would spread in particular through the border areas, because you have Poland and Ukraine in particular, a few other nationalities as well, overlapped with the German and Austrian empires. So you had big Polish populations in both the Russian Empire and the German Empire. You had big Ukrainian populations, particularly in the Austrian Empire and the Russian Empire. So the conception was the revolution would spread kind of directly via the borderlands westwards. And this is not a minor point, because everybody assumed, I think, and they were proven right, that if the Russian Revolution was left isolated, that it wouldn't be able to fulfill its promise and it would be defeated. And I do think Stalinism is a form of defeat. And so then if you want to understand how and why we don't have socialism today, or how and why Stalinism arose in Central Russia, or even how and why the development of the Austrian and German revolutions developed as they did, you have to look at what happened in Poland, you have to look at what happened in Ukraine, in which the revolution, instead of sort of having a bridge to the West, ended up coming up against a barrier. And this was very, very unexpected because the revolutionary movements had been very strong there and quite radical. And it might take us a little too much detail to explain, what went wrong in Poland and Ukraine. But the point is, historically, this is like this major pivot in world history. And people have underestimated the extent to which that pivot was based in the borderlands of the Russian Revolution.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I mean, you go into such detail. You also talk, you talk about how these different organizations in these different countries, how they organize themselves, how they hold meetings, and how they get new members, etc. How they stand for electoral work. So it's a pretty extensive thing, and yeah, very interesting. I've never heard anybody speak about this stuff before. Granted, I'm not history buff, so I might have missed it. Great. I would like to already come. Yeah, we still have a bit of time, but maybe come to like a couple of final questions. So maybe this one. So for me, this whole discussion that we also allured to in a minute ago. When I consume American podcasts, which I do sometimes, I hear that this debate is ongoing and pretty polarized at the moment in the US. So you have the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. They're trying to put up candidates for Democratic primaries, and the goal presumably is to then play an inside game with the Democratic Party, take it over maybe in the future, or be able to shift it so far to the left, and then maybe create some kind of split, even a party split in the end or something like that. And so basically, if you want to summarize this or just be abstract about it, go the parliamentary way and try to reach power through the parliamentary democracy. Or, well, do you have a parliamentary democracy? No, that's not a parliamentary democracy. That's, how do you call that? A Senate democracy or something like that? Anyway, and your argument in the book seems to justify that strategy. So there is this fight going on, and I also saw a debate between you and Sawant on, she taking the other side and saying, no, we should stick to the revolutionary, anti-democratic, anti-state strategy. And I always wonder in these discussions, why is it that we are still stuck in these kind of debates that are already still, some of them over 100 years old, and they're mainly strategic debates, even as if we don't have a theoretical disagreement in the sense of, we all understand what is capital, we all understand what the value form is, we all understand what money is, what the state is, and we're just fighting about the strategy, which I really don't think is the case, even for people like Lenin and the Bolsheviks. I think there's a lot to critique there, and we should actually go and study that. And I wonder, I'm trying to put this into a question now. This is really just like an open thought, but I wonder if we as a left, by the way, not only in the US, it's the same here in Germany, like if this is not some kind of coping mechanism to cope with the the insight that we are actually quite powerless and can't do much, and that's why we grab and hold on to these things that give us identity and meaning and sense of belonging, while we should actually be more scientific, the way that you basically call us to be, and say, okay, these two ways were there, or there were a couple of ways back then, but it doesn't mean that we have to do it the same way, and we should try to find new ways. So, I mean, I'm just putting this on your table now, and maybe give us your thoughts on this dilemma. What do you think?
Yeah. So first, just to talk maybe a little bit about the US, and I think the way you framed it there, I would frame it differently.
Okay, sure. Go ahead.
So, for instance, the book, I don't actually see the book as a justification one way or the other for like what we do in the Democratic Party today, because it doesn't talk about that. And actually, I'm not arguing in the book for like a parliamentary first strategy even. And I don't think DSA, and certainly I wouldn't argue for that in the US. The argument is actually you need to combine electoral politics with mass disruptive movements from below. This is more or less what I think is a viable strategy in capitalist democracies, which is actually quite different than like sort of moderate social democracy, which was overwhelmingly electoral. So I don't think that's the difference. And second, on the Democratic Party, this isn't sort of I put it this way, it isn't actually kind of a old dogmatic debate that we're just rehashing because we don't have power. I would argue it's the opposite, which is to say the reason that for decades the US left was sort of dogmatically oriented towards at no point can you ever work within the Democratic Party was in part based off of experience, up to this time, but was also a reflection of just the complete marginality of the US left up until 2016. Okay. We're talking about extremely small groups with very little social base and very little power. And so that changed. And what led to these recent debates, and because I used to believe this too, up until 2016, I believed, and I could have given you all the historical reasons for why ever working within the Democratic Party is wrong. And then, life proved me wrong, and it proved a lot of our comrades wrong, and we switched our position because we saw through experience, not from sort of actually old debates. We just saw through experience that actually the Bernie Sanders campaign and then the election of the Squad and then the election of democratic socialists in places like New York and elsewhere was not leading to co-optation, but actually was leading to the biggest surge in socialism in the US in many, 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 many decades. And it led to an amount of power that as far as political influence, it's not like we control the state, but we, at this point, as the socialist movement in the US, for the first time in decades, are like an actual presence that people beyond just the radical fringes understand that there's an alternative to capitalism. They may disagree with it or not, but the question of debating socialism is very central now. The Republicans are always accusing the Democrats of being socialist. So it's like we have this outsized influence, and that is a huge breakthrough that we shouldn't underestimate. And the debates really are born out of this. And I would argue that people who are sticking to like the old line of never work with the Democrats are hewing to kind of more dogmatic approach that just can't make sense of the current realities, because the current dynamic is not that we're getting co-opted, but it's actually that we are building independent antagonistic power, both against the Republicans and Democratic Party establishment, with whom we sometimes have to be in tactical alliance. So that is just to say, that's the way I look at the US today. And more generally, I do think the book tries to combine a case for why certain aspects of socialist politics are still relevant from the era of the Second International. So I don't just say, oh, it would be very easy to say, well, this is a very long time ago, like the situation is different.
Yeah, sure.
But I actually argue that certain things are still relevant. So for instance, the centrality of class politics, the extent to which political parties help create class identities. So right now, class politics is relatively marginal in many places, but maybe that's in part because we don't have mass political parties making a case and trying to organize workers as workers. That's one thing that I see from this history is still relevant. The question of unity, for instance, which we haven't talked about, but I have this whole chapter on the centrality of trying to unite workers across their divisions, unite political fractions across divisions. To me, this is like this extremely relevant point in which the left is often terrible at. And I show that in the Russian Empire, the most successful parties were the parties that were able to work with people whom they disagreed and then just sort of split over doctrine at all times. And this question of building practical unity and then also trying to find, when you can, strategic unity becomes much more central in the Russian Empire. And I think that's something that we can learn today. And so maybe I'll just leave it at that, which is to say that although there's certain aspects of this history that are like not replicable, I don't think we can just replicate either the Bolshevik or Finnish model. There's a lot of very rich experience that we need to sort of lean on as we think through the dilemmas that we have today and to really parse out rigorously what is relevant and what is not relevant.
Excellent. I mean, my last question would have been, what do you think are the takeaways from that book and from your research for current political movements? And is there anything else on that question that you would like to add, or are you done with takeaways? What do you think?
The last thing I would say, and this is the point I made earlier, is that one of the points I try to get at in the book, and that I still think is relevant, is that it is possible to combine an electoral strategy with a movement towards the sort of a mass movement, social movement from below strategy. And this is something that cuts against both sort of traditional social democracy in the moderate electoral sense and the Leninism, which had like a very kind of always was bottom up. And I think trying to bring back the possibility of combining a serious electoral approach in which you are trying to like take power and pass wins with simultaneously rebuilding a mass labor movement, building strikes from below. This, I think, is the strategic sweet spot. And so much of the problem is that the debates tend to get polarized excessively between one or the other. And the possibility for synthesizing this, I think, has been shown historically. And we're seeing that in the most successful places of the left today. You know, throughout Latin America, certainly in Chile, just to give one example, you can see how the radical left both leaned on mass disruption, but then didn't say, yeah, that's why we're going to reject elections, or reject the state. That's why they used elections to try to democratize the state, which in turn is pushing for sort of social transformation. And that's not easy. Part of the reason that we lose so much as the left is not that our strategies are wrong, but our enemies are extremely powerful. You know, that's an unfortunate reality, and it'd be easy to blame ourselves. But oftentimes we lose just because capitalism is strong, capitalists are strong. And so I can't tell you what will happen in Chile, but you can look at where people get further. And the places where people get furthest is because there's a combination of mass disruptive action from below, particularly in workplaces and labor movement, with a real working class presence within the state and the electoral arena. And so to me, that is the road that we should be trying to head down. And we're going to have to learn what the dilemmas that entail as we go along.
All right, great. The book is Revolutionary Social Democracy, Working Class Politics Across the Russian Empire, 1882 to 1917. Eric, you have anything new coming? Another book planned for the next 10 years or something like that? Yeah,
actually, I'm starting to work on it. Most of my it's funny because sometimes I get accused of being an electoralist, you know, sort of like a moderate social democrat, but actually most of my organizing and writing is about the labor movement. And so my new book that I'm starting to work on is on the recent labor surge in the United States with Amazon, Starbucks, and the new organizing that's happening, and trying to look at, it's called DIY unionism, do-it-yourself unionism. It's trying to look at what it looks like to organize in workplaces when you don't have a lot of support from existing unions.
Cool. Sounds good. Sounds like we're going to invite you for that one too, once it comes out in 1 year, 2 years, not 10 years.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. No, all like biggest respect. It's really a very, very impressive work. And again, everybody read that book. Eric, thanks for being here. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me on.
Have a nice day over there and hope to see you soon. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Leute, wir brauchen eure Hilfe. Wenn euch dieses Video gefallen hat, klickt auf Like, abonniert den Kanal und vergesst nicht das Glöckchen zu drücken, damit ihr benachrichtigt werdet, wenn wir neuen Content droppen.
Außerdem solltet ihr uns überall folgen, wo wir verfügbar sind. Das ist Facebook, Instagram, Twitter und Twitch. Und wenn wir irgendwelche Ankündigungen machen oder Posts, dann shared, was das Zeug hält. Gebt uns all eure Liebe.
Wir haben mittlerweile ziemlich signifikante Kosten. Wenn ihr es euch irgendwie leisten könnt, unterstützt uns doch auf Patreon. Dann kommt ihr auch in den Genuss verschiedener Vorteile, wie zum Beispiel Zugang zu unserer Discord-Community oder Zugang zu den ultrageheimen Patreon-Episoden, die wir dort posten. Außerdem könnt ihr uns natürlich auch über PayPal Spenden zukommen lassen.
Außerdem haben wir mittlerweile einen eigenen Online-Shop. Das heißt, wenn ihr euch immer noch fragt, was ihr euren Lieben zu Weihnachten, Ostern oder sonst wie schenken könnt, geht dorthin und kauft duftes Merch.
Alle Links dazu hier in der Beschreibung oder auch auf unserer Webseite 99zu1.de.
Vielen Dank fürs Dabeisein, danke für die Unterstützung und wir sehen uns in diesem Theater.